This is your urgent call to action. We are all called to lead in a world in chaos, crisis, and turmoil. Join a pivotal global movement for change to transform the leadership crisis worldwide. Will you play it safe, or will you wake up, step up, and speak out? Like Nelson Mandela did for South Africa and the world, we need a radical new way to think, act, and lead, leading boldly into the future. Join host Ann Pratt, a Harvard Fellow and multi-awarded businesswoman, and unlock the best version of yourself to revolutionize leadership with what the world needs now.
Greetings to all you future bold leaders. Thank you for joining us from around the world. My name is Ann Pratt, formerly from South Africa, and relocated abroad to attend a Harvard Leadership Fellowship in Boston, Massachusetts, in the United States of America. Our bold leader today joins us from the Western Cape on the southern tip of Africa in Montague, surrounded by scenic mountains, hot mineral springs, and beautiful old Cape Dutch and Georgian homes in the western Little Karoo. He is a global expert on corporate governance, having worked in some 85 countries and consulted to governments, regulators, the World Bank, and numerous boardrooms worldwide. His outstanding work has attracted recognition and awards in several countries, including the United Kingdom, South Africa, India, Abu Dhabi, the capital of the United Arab Emirates, and an honorary doctorate from Oxford University in the United Kingdom. Stay with us as we explore and uncover what is good corporate governance, how he exercised moral courage early on in his career, the changing role and duties of boards and directors in the past, in the present, and in the future, and how an emotional Mandela moment provides valuable and current insights for leaders in all sectors trying to navigate this worst pandemic in more than 100 years and the ever-increasing threat of climate change in our deeply divided world. We warmly welcome Phil Armstrong and welcome to Leading Boldly into the Future. Phil, it's wonderful to have you with us. Always lovely to connect and chat with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne, and thanks for having me.
You know, you've had such a wonderful, remarkable international career, starting in South Africa, but then working around the world. What has been the most inspiring part of your career, Phil?
I think it's, I've been lucky and I've been fortunate in my career in the sense that I can't say that I had a very specific pathway that I had in mind. I think it was more, I was given opportunities and I took advantage of the opportunities, and I had the benefit of a lot of mentors along the way. I've worked with many boards, both in the state-owned sector, the public quoted sector. And I think it was just, to see how boards operate, how they think about things, how that sort of, from my own observations, what often gets missed, what sometimes the, opportunities that are, clear opportunities that are missed in those meetings, and where the whole issue of moral courage tends to come in sometimes, or just in terms of, being clear on your mission and purpose. That was the one side. The other side was just in terms of my, I worked in some 85 countries around the world during my time. Was really just to understand how different cultures, what you see is not always what other people see themselves, and learning to understand that. So when you are sometimes in difficult situations or situations of potential conflict, is to try to understand the cultural dynamics, the sort of historical dynamics, there's a whole framework of environmental framework, you might call it, around people, around situations and circumstances that you have to be clear about, but at the same time, not losing your own moral compass in that process.
That's such an important topic, and we're going to come back to that. Share with us for a moment perhaps as a starting point for our audience, how would you define, you're a global expert, how would you define good corporate governance? What is it?
I think, I don't know, I've always found it, it's however you describe it, it's still a bit of a mystery to many people. But the very basic element of governance is its definition as defined by the late Sir Adrian Cadbury, which is really a system by which companies are directed and controlled. What that means, in essence, is you have mechanisms in the company around controls and procedures in terms of how reports are received by the board, how the board, in turn, uses its directorial authority, essentially, to assess and evaluate those reports and proposals put by management. And then in the decision process it flows is how they then control the effective implementation of those decisions, the question of accountability around those decisions, and then how that's reported, not just from the management to the board, but from the board to its stakeholders, its shareholders, and its public at large. So
Yes.
It's at its most basic form, it's really just how you structure your board, how you empower your management, and then how you account for that to your shareholders and investors.
That's excellent, Phil. And, given your span of experience, how would you describe the change that has taken place between the role of the board and directors in the past, in the present day, and then, of course, to the future? Could you take us through how that has evolved?
Well, I think the original role of a board was very much focused on essentially its financial performance. It was ensuring that that the decisions made, a lot of the structure and basis on which decisions were taken and made or considered was largely centered historically, going back in the past, really around the financial metrics that drive the business.
Yes.
In terms of its profits, in terms of its sales, in terms of its sort of key strategic objectives, which mostly had a financial metric associated with it. The board directors were largely people who came to meetings intermittently. I wouldn't say they were not necessarily hugely engaged in the business. Any board director should always have been, but they basically it was very much a process built around the boardroom and what took place in the boardroom.
Yeah,
I think what we're seeing in the current era is there is increasing levels of complexity around how decisions are considered, made, and then taken and implemented. Because it's no longer just simply about the financial metrics and your profit performance. It's become a much more complicated and complex exercise in terms of environmental, social, and governance standards.
Yes.
And also because of the wide diversity of shareholders that you can have investing in your company, all of them having potentially different objectives, different criteria on which they place a particular emphasis. So the role of the board member now is, to my mind, is to not only understand the business and to have a really good understanding of the business, because they often find themselves, you play a role in compensation issues, you play a role in succession issues, you play a role very much around key strategic issues, which sometimes are influenced by external factors.
Yes.
So external factors and events. And then then an understanding of the external factors that then determine how you should think about your decisions. If you think of a director right now in a coal mining company and the issues that they have to reflect on, currently their reflection would have probably been much more around environmental aspects in terms of how they basically justify the protection of their protection of the environment around which the mines operate, and also around the welfare, for example, of the employees, for example. But as we go into the future, that's going to be a very different discussion. It's no longer it may well just be about the survival of the business and whether this business has to, think about a very different future if there is, in terms of fossil fuels and what it's engaged in. So what I'm trying to say in summary is historically a lot of the focus is around what took place in the boardroom and very much centered around financial metrics and how you account for that to your shareholders. We've moved to one where there's a much broader scope of stakeholders, all having an interest in your business, whether that's, and one has to be careful, I say, but you can't be accountable to everybody because then you're accountable to no one.
Yeah.
But the challenge is how you address all those different demands on you, from public policy issues to community issues to social activist interests, right down to your actual shareholders. And the shareholders, there are some which are very active around ESG issues and sustainability issues. There are others who perhaps are just more focused on the financial metrics itself and the returns that derive from that. But you really have to understand an environment that exists beyond the boardroom as well as within the boardroom. Going forward, I think the big challenge for boards and governance is going to be, we're moving into some very sophisticated challenges around climate, around cybersecurity, supply chain issues, all of these issues. And one of the big challenges, I think, for most boardrooms is whether the composition of the board is sufficient, one, to support the strategy that is in place, possibly defined by some of those events, and secondly, having directors who really understand public policy issues and those types and issues of public interest that will very often play an influence on how you make decisions.
That's such an important point, Phil. We know a lot of the work we did with boards in South Africa, and as South Africa went through its own transition, that the whole issue of board composition was critical in terms of representing different stakeholders. So for the boards around the world today, and of course America has got its own strife right now, but many other countries have too, what are some of the lessons do you think we've learned in South Africa, but also, just from a broad governance point of view, what are some of those board composition key requirements? What would you say to chairmen of boards and board nomination committees today around their board composition? What's important?
Well, firstly, I think the first thing is the board has to be aligned with the strategy. There has to be, to my mind, there has to be a strong symmetry between the composition of the board and how it advises management. In other words, the caliber it has on the board to advise management in terms of their background, expertise, knowledge, and what have you, relative to the strategy that the board has in place.
Yes.
Now, I know a lot of people say that's obvious, but I can run off a number of examples where that was not obvious in some of the boardrooms I spoke to, and I just two very quick examples. One was a board which, one of its major lines of business was women's fashion retail.
Yes.
But in the boardroom, I didn't see anybody in that boardroom who looked to me like someone who understood women's fashion. Another one was a company which had at that time 80% of its business in China. And the challenge I put to the board was, so who's the expert on China in the room, expecting to see someone possibly of Chinese origin. And it was basically a local guy who goes to China every 6 weeks. Yeah. He was the expert on China. All I'm saying is I would have thought about it differently. That doesn't make sense to me. And it's simple things like that. I think the second thing is when you talk about a boardroom now, you've got to, you for example, on your audit committee, whoever chairs and populates your audit committee has to be people who not only understand the current requirements that currently fit within the more conventional auditing environment, but there's a huge lot of dynamics taking place around the future of financial reporting and accountability. And so you've got to have people who understand what's coming down the road and what is it that may be within that they need to contextualize the board to understand it needs to think about and by definition management. Another area around compensation is the alignment between what you state, your sort of not just your strategic objectives, but the framework in which you define them, given the plethora of environmental, social, and governance standards, in other words, ESG standards that exist in the world, and who are your investors, and how will that inform the way you perhaps define and set your standards, and then how do you ensure, basically, as I've always said, what gets measured gets done. So how do you then translate those objectives from mere principles of good intent into actually hardcore or hardwired criteria, which are key performance indicators that become key performance indicators for management, and therefore to ensure that the outcomes match the objectives.
Yeah.
Those are just a few issues. I mean, there's a lot one can talk about,
of course,
because being a board director now is, to my mind, is a very, very challenging proposition.
Yeah, but to your point around diversity and inclusion, which is obviously it's a hot issue and an important issue. So from a diversity inclusion point of view, if I hear you correctly, what you're saying is making sure that board composition includes representatives from the markets that boards are serving in terms of multiple stakeholders,
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think when you talk diversity and inclusion, the one thing that always worries me, I mean, yes, there's a clear issue around gender, and increasingly, and certainly in a number of countries like the US and UK as examples that come to mind, are issues around ethnic representation.
Yes.
The worry I have very often, it seems to get reduced to a numbers game, instead of actually there's plenty of talent out there. It's not a numbers game. It's about finding people who will genuinely bring value to your business, and they certainly are out there. It's a question of finding them.
It is, and perhaps to your point about the recruitment process and having been involved in an executive search for so many years, I mean, also sometimes it's about the open-mindedness of the board nomination committee in terms of their willingness. Sometimes I think boards need these champions of change with a different mindset. And there are many examples that I could quote as well in terms of having that mindset, saying, is there the talent? And then saying, oh my goodness, I didn't know there was so much talent. But it takes a particular board mindset to open up to, the usual kind of board members and look for new talent, to come through. Yeah,
there's always an inclination by boards. And I've seen it when I've been supporting boards in their recruitment efforts. And there's this, if nothing else, there's this unconscious bias. I think sometimes it's more than unconscious personally, but there's you can see this distinctive unconscious bias about who they would be comfortable with in the room, and it's trying to break them out of that.
Exactly.
And that's a challenging process to get boards to get there. But once they get there and they discover this, it sort of then seems to then open it out. But it remains a challenge. I think this is not unusual to any boardroom just about anywhere in the world.
Yeah, it's such an important point about, getting comfortable with being uncomfortable and just breaking those habits of old. You've touched on a couple of topics that, are increasingly important. I mean, they've always been important, but the issue of accountability and moral courage. Is there an example you can share of a difficult situation for a board or a company that was faced with a tough decision around holding, whether it be a chief executive officer or a director, or holding somebody accountable and making that decision of moral courage, knowing that one should do the right thing for the right reasons? Do you have an example where you've seen that play out in a very positive way, or do you have some broad principles around what boards should do to strengthen their moral backbone?
The issue for most boards, I think, starts with the board chair, and the board chair having to be somebody who is almost sometimes in a role of being an arbitrator, in the sense that they have to earn the respect of the board, so that when they do get into really, really tough situations, they're able to carry the board with them, even if it's choices that the board itself is not comfortable making.
Yes.
And that quite often is, of course, around the chief executive. But the issue is but and the issue then is the big challenge for most boardrooms is how you basically desensitize the emotional aspect. In other words, turn it down to a purely objective criteria and take the emotion out of the discussion. And that requires a very astute board chair to do that, to be able to carry the board in such a way as to look at the hard criteria, not just and not to take a defensive posture, particularly, for example, if you have investors who are perhaps putting pressure on the company, they feel there are some performance issues that of which they have a great deal of concern. Then the question is it straight away, the board sort of tends to come to the defense of the CEO, sometimes correctly, sometimes perhaps not so. And it's the ability of the chair to be able to try to get the board to desensitize that. And sometimes what it's best to do is to try, this is where the role of the independent director becomes important. Because and provided it's somebody who is independent in the sense they've been on that board maybe a couple of years and are genuinely remain independent, not necessarily detached, but independent. But and then, as I've been involved in, is then establish a small committee of the independent directors to unemotionally look at the issue, and then to come back with recommendations, which then gives the chair a platform on which to be able to create a discussion and engagement with the board.
I'm with you. Yeah, that makes sense. Just in terms of governance, and I'm mindful of the fact that we're talking about this predominantly in the corporate business sector. Can you just highlight for our audience out there, to what extent do the same corporate governance principles apply across the public sector and the civic sector? And how is it different?
Perhaps dealing with the differences first. In the public sector, the challenge is generally there's one key stakeholder, which is either the government or some local, either the principal, the main government of the country, or a local government authority, or whatever it might be. County authority, perhaps if you're in the US. So the problem there is that, and a lot of their calculation is political, because that's why they're there. They're politicians, so their calculations are not always based on just sheer commercial common sense. There's political baggage that gets played into it. For example, if you've got a poor performing public sector operation, and there's a call to rationalize the business or the operation and to perhaps retrench a whole bunch of people, that may have consequences for some of the politicians in the ruling government of the day. And straight away that gets brought into the debate. On the civic side, the issue again is, the civic side is that, you have people who are, ideologically committed to an issue. And the question is how open-minded they are willing and can be. The second one, which is one I've seen quite a few problems with, is the funders. But the funders are funding you for a certain outcome, to in some ways justify the reason they funded you by virtue of who they themselves account to. And that starts influencing how you get pushed in a direction, because that's the outcome they need from you to justify the funding they gave to you. So then coming back to what is it about? To my mind, the principles are very much the same. So in each case, you have a level of accountability and you have a level of responsibility. You have a level of accountability for using, in the case of public corporations, the funds that are entrusted to you, which is generally taxpayer funds, in a proper and appropriate way. And that is properly accountable back to Parliament or government. And that at the same time, you are to deliver a service that people have paid for through their taxes, that one would expect to be the best that they can offer. And the same with the civic society. If they're operating with a community, there's an expectation from the community around that you're going to use the funds given to you properly, that you're going to take decisions that are both responsible and honest, and at the same time of, that have the interests of the community and that you're willing to account for that. So then the question is making sure that whether it's a governing body of some sort for the civic society or a board of a public, state-owned corporation or public corporation, that it is, again, still is populated by the people that can oversee that is fulfilled properly, and that they in turn ensure that the management or people that serve those organizations, whether it's a public or civic organization, themselves are fulfilling their responsibilities in a proper and appropriate way.
What practically could the politician do, knowing that the decision will be an unpopular decision, but they've got an election coming up? What would your advice be?
Well, this is the hard chestnut of the issue. There's no easy decision. I think there's no easy way to promote it, because to my mind, the easier way is that a state-owned corporation or public corporation, however it may be termed in different countries, is there to provide a public service to the country or to a particular region of the country, whatever the case might be. And the issue is you've got to detach the commercial and business decisions and operational decisions that utility has to take, distinct from the political interests that use it as a tool and can, at the long term, be detrimental to the overall welfare of your country's citizens. And it's trying to have that discussion with politicians. And listen, I've been in those discussions. I've been in discussions, around the world on exactly that.
Do you have an example that comes to mind?
Well, the biggest example, because I've got a lot of examples. I guess the examples I have would be, if I think about South Africa and working with one of its biggest utilities, as it was at the time, and I was asked to evaluate the board. And the issue I had there was a twofold issue. One was there were government representatives, there were government-appointed representatives of the board, as well as government officials. The officials saw their role. They saw this as an extension of their day job, which was not in their job description. So for them coming to the board meeting, it was one big hassle, and the only interest they had was being sure that when they went back to talk to their minister, that board did what they needed it to do, so they didn't get into trouble with their minister. So that you had to isolate that. Then there were the people who were nominated there, who saw themselves as there essentially through political affiliation. And the issue was to try and harness that. Then they had the specialists, who were actually international specialists serving on the board at the time, who were really there to help this utility in South Africa with the best possible advice in terms of what equivalent utilities were doing around the world, which was the expertise they would bring, and was trying to harness that together. But the real challenge was, and this was a discussion that was elevated to government, was how you separate the political interference with the day-to-day operation of business. And the intention at the time was essentially to enter into what we called a compact, a public compact. The compact was between the National Treasury, which did not want to necessarily finance any shortcomings through the fiscus. They wanted this business to have good standing in the international market, so that it could raise funding in international markets at competitive rates through a good rating of the governance of the business. Then at the other side then you still had the particular ministry that was involved, which was there to oversee the provision of those services, and how you try to separate those government decisions that took place, and then how it fed through an agreed compact with clear objectives and criteria, so that every time there was a political challenge, you would go back to the compact and would say, these are the criteria negotiated with government, signed off by government, and now that's our obligation, our contractual obligation to deliver this.
So it's a pre-negotiation of these competing interests.
that is basically a way of handling it. I'm not saying it worked everywhere, but that was a way in which it was presented. Unfortunately, there was a change of government in South Africa, I think, and then during that period, of course, South Africa ran into many problems, and particularly this utility. But, I've always said that the approach that the Nordics have taken and the way they run their state-owned corporate utilities is probably one of the sort of best practice models.
Can you give us a very specific example? I mean, is there one that comes to mind just to bring it to life?
Well, it really, well, look at Norway. All the companies, and I haven't looked at this for some time, so I want to be careful with the facts I give. But in Norway, there's basically an oversight body. In other words, the oversight of the state utilities falls within a supervision authority, which is separate from the politicians. So the supervision authority is where a lot of the political versus commercial issues are percolated and then, if necessary, negotiated in regard to the utility and its objectives. But there was always a clearly negotiated distinction between its public interest objectives in terms of services to be delivered and its commercial objectives to make it two things. One, a viable operation commercially, and secondly, it was not a burden on the state and the fiscus. And that applies to all state utilities. And I haven't looked at this for a few years now, but that was very much the principle that the Norwegians, the Swedes, and the Finns have regarding their state utilities. And it's interesting how it's been very difficult, but I think it's a cultural thing. It's very difficult for many other countries to adopt that.
Well, that's an interesting example. It's a complex process, and of course, as you say, the cultural dynamics per country also shape what's done and how it's done. Just kind of shifting gear completely, Phil, just in your own life, you've had a remarkable career. You've worked in 80 countries around the world. What has been a moment, a kind of life-defining moment for you? A personal big challenge, a crucible? What was it? Can you take us back in time, a specific example, and what was that moment? What was that challenge?
Yeah, I've had a few of those, to be honest. But I think each one sort of strengthens the definition of how you see yourself as you progress, and you learn from the other one around things you might have done better. The one that I always remember was early in my career. I was working for an organization or a public corporation, a well-known South African corporation that was in a massive expansion, and it was
a listed entity, right?
It was a quoted entity.
Yeah,
it was in a massive growth expansion. I have to confess, largely built off the back of the US, a lot of US companies divesting from South Africa. But basically, it was also around that .com bubble era. The challenge that came up was that we remember, you might recall, when the .com bubble burst pretty much around the world, there was obviously there were a number of consequences, and there was one particular situation where this was an organization led by a very strong-minded, strong-willed patriarch who owned a large majority of the business. And he had never really found himself in a situation where his companies were not successful. So that was a very strong, a big moral dilemma from him, was this idea that he actually had a failure in his group of companies. So that was one problem. The second problem was being a fairly formidable character. Most people were trying to find a way in which to make him happy. So that led to the next step, which was then trying to find a way in which this business could be rescued through a particular deal with an investor that would, for all intents and purposes, look like the situation had been largely salvaged. But the problem was, I was at the time the corporate secretary and obviously responsible for corporate governance. I worked closely with the stock exchange, and the regulators. And the problem was that on the face of it, technically, the deal looked like it could be doable.
Can we just understand, sorry, Phil, I mean, the company, so during the dot-com bubble, maybe you can just define that, but during that, what happened? Did the company crash? Can you just tell us what was the circumstance?
Well, basically what happened, we went through worldwide, there was this massive IT industry just grew exponentially.
Yes.
And just about everybody who was anybody seemed to get into the business.
Yeah.
But the problem was in this particular one, it was a company that had reached a point where the market, obviously the valuations of these businesses were found out effectively. The valuations didn't justify the assets and the substance of the business and the potential future returns.
Yeah.
And the problem was then that started having repercussions around your supply chain, in terms of how whether you were a retailer or a wholesaler, in terms of how you receive goods, how you sold goods. And this business ran into a cash crunch. It basically was primarily
a cash crunch. It was a cash crunch.
Okay. But it was over leveraged.
Yeah.
On the basis that this market was just going to sort of continue exponentially grow. Yes. And it suddenly stopped.
It stopped. So the deal was to actually inject more cash into the business and reevaluate the business?
Yes, was to really re-inject cash into the business and try to recapitalize it. But basically the numbers in the business didn't look good. And so to go into the public markets and recapitalize it probably would have raised more questions and would have solved anything. Mm-hmm. So the idea was to try to recapitalize it through essentially a private transaction with a particular investor, with whom the group was associated, but not with this company directly. And they were willing to basically inject the cash, but there were then going to be some sweetheart deals on the side. As if this was successful in the recovery, there were certain sweetheart deals around how this would be represented. But central to all of that was the issue of control. Mm-hmm. So the question is, how do you inject cash to capitalize a business and at the same time you still retain a majority control of the business? Mm-hmm. That at a certain point that cash was going to have to be transferred into equity, and equity would have resulted in you losing control of the business. So it was the attempt was a bit of a finagle around how to get the cash, which will later be converted to equity, but it's still at the same time not lose control.
Mm-hmm. So how did you feel at the time, Phil? I mean, was this
that's where I'm coming to. So my problem was the mechanics of it could be argued with some imagination. The worry I had was two things. One is it didn't feel right, and to my mind, I was going to be the one who was going to have to go and sell this. And in my own heart of hearts, it was difficult for me to do that because I just did not feel committed to the transaction in the way it was being constructed. And then the second part was as corporate secretary of the group, I also had my first and foremost obligation was to ensure the group itself was not in any way impoverished by the transaction, or in some ways have its reputation impaired for any reason. And therefore my interest was with for the patriarch and chair of the business. Now the problem was no one wanted to give him the bad news. So he was sitting in the room with the deputy chairman who was responsible for putting this together, along with the usual corporate finance people and the lawyers and everybody, the usual group of people, cast of characters. My challenge was I had a moment. There was a moment in the meeting where I had to speak up. And the question was, firstly, when do I time that moment? And then what the heck do I say to these people? Anyway, a moment did come in the meeting. There was a funny pause in the meeting, and I stepped up and I said, listen, I've got some real problems here. And this is why I have the problems. I said,
and what was the problem? I mean, in terms of the structure of the deal, I'm just trying to understand, was it about putting the cash in, which would need to translate to equity, but was there a way of trying to sell the fact that the person putting the cash in would not necessarily have that share or equity stake in the business. Was that?
Exactly. That is
Okay.
exactly it.
Okay.
So the issue was, and I said, it's just, I said, for me, it's about the principle of what we're trying to accomplish here. And I felt that in principle, it would be hard for me to sell it to the regulator, although I probably could, but I'm not committed to doing it because I'm not prepared to put my own personal reputation on the line.
Yeah.
I'm not prepared to put the reputation of the group on the line. And I'm not prepared to put which by definition would be the reputation of the chair and patriarch of the business, of the overall group business. The problem was that everybody else was there trying to please the chair, and I was basically saying that I think you have to let this go.
Yeah.
I think you have to let this thing. You can't turn. There's that English expression. You can't turn a sow's ear into a silk purse.
Yeah.
And that was fundamentally what I was trying to say to them. And anyway, I suppose the long story short is it got very heated. The deputy chairman leaning over the boardroom table with his finger halfway through my eye, telling me I was insubordinate. This is ridiculous. Who the heck was I to even do this? And when we finish the meeting, he's going to deal with me and I'm going to get fired. So I said, well...
And Phil, can I just clarify one thing? I mean, one of the points you made to the chair, who was the majority shareholder of the group, was that not only was it your reputation or the reputation of the group, but it was his personal reputation that would also be compromised.
I didn't play that card. My card was it was the reputation of the group.
The group. Okay.
And I left him to decide, well, if it's a reputation of a group, it has to, by definition, be his reputation.
I'm with you.
I didn't want to be one of those people who says, I'm looking after you, so you've got to decide whether my choice is to your benefit or their choice is to your benefit, because both groups, being me and them, were both seeking to please them, but in a different way.
I'm with you.
And mine was different, led to some degree by my own moral compass, that this didn't smell right, it didn't feel right.
Yeah.
And as my father used to tell me, then that probably isn't right.
Yeah.
So, and that was the sort of the calculation I had to take. The chair, by the way, was simply there as an observer. He was not a participant. He was just interested in understanding what this deal was.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, the meeting broke up in disarray. The next day, we left it all at that, and everyone decided to go away and sort of calm down. And the next day, when I was walking into the office in the morning, the chair came past. And this is a funny anecdote, but it's about contextualizing it. Whenever that chairman wore, and he was a male, so hence chairman, he always wore a brown suit. That was a day that you knew it was a day to keep away from him. I don't know what it was about him and his brown suit, but that was never a good day in the office.
Yeah.
He came up to me and I thought, oh my goodness, this is tomorrow's going to begin again. Yesterday's going to begin today. And he said to me, thanks for standing up. Thanks for presenting a side of the transaction I had not myself understood. And I agree with you. Anyway, the deal was unwound. They unwound the deal. I wasn't very popular, the deputy chair thereafter, but my first, I generally reported to the chairman anyway. But I think what was important was not to try and use him as my shield and sort of almost unwittingly draw him into the discussion. I felt the issue was how I felt about it, what that meant for the group, and then to be willing and able to, as best as I could, to then challenge the different aspects of the transaction.
How did you feel at the end of this? I mean, how did you feel in that moment, Phil?
Which moment? The one at the meeting?
When the chair came up and thanked you.
I felt good about it, but I also felt I'd been, for me, it felt that I was vindicated, that the decision I took, although it was at some peril to myself, just strengthened my view that, if you do the right thing and it's presented in the right way, and you don't try to draw in allegiances and loyalties, but simply present the basic facts, as hard as it is and as difficult as it is, there are people in this world who will recognize exception. I've had a number of instances like that throughout my career where I've had to do that.
So I just want to check in on that one first. So that could have gone either way, Phil. I mean, that could have had that ending. It could have had a very different ending. You could have been fired. Yes. What would you say to people out there where they have to exercise their moral courage in a very difficult moment, where they could have lost their job, they have families to take care of? What do you say to those people, and how related to that, how do you fortify your moral courage in those very difficult, life-defining moments, career-defining moments, certainly?
I mean, I've had this discussion with people before, and I can't be sort of sitting here thinking that this is an easy thing to do. I think it's very much dependent on the individual and the circumstances in which they find themselves.
But for you, what defined that decision for you in that moment? What your risk-reward analysis, how did you in that moment say, I'm going to say and do the right thing? What fortified?
I think it was just the fact that very simply put, is that I work on a principle that everything I do, I must walk away from it with a clear conscience. I must be able to go back and feel comfortable that I did the best I could in the circumstances I found myself. Mm-hmm. And if it was only to express my view, if it was overruled, there's not much I could do. I was an employee and I would be tasked to get it done, but I wouldn't have to carry the conviction that I would be required to carry. But my conviction's always been built on my own conscience and the fact that can I defend it? Is it something I can defend to myself? Is it something, if I'm questioned years later on, I can defend? And ultimately, I was at the beginning, an early stage of my career, and for me, reputation is everything. Reputation is an important part of who I am. And if you're going to be involved as a corporate secretary or in the world of corporate governance, you can't have one standard for yourself and a standard for somebody else.
Of course.
I've always. There was this great Stephen Covey quote that I've always carry with me, mm-hmm. which is about sticking to your values. Mm-hmm. And that quote, Stephen Covey says, is you can't talk yourself out of a problem that you behaved yourself into. And that's a little bit how I see how a bit of a sort of litmus test I tend to follow. And one I try to promote to others. But as I said, I'm never going to judge someone, because people have their own situations, and in an environment, as you said, with wife, children, commitments, mm-hmm. a mortgage, whatever. It's a difficult decision. The advice I've always given people is that if you find yourself in that situation, be clear about your facts.
Yeah,
you have to be convinced of your position on the issue. You can't waver in the middle of it, because then.
Sure.
To my mind, at least, you somehow compromise yourself, and you won't. You're gonna not feel great about it afterwards, I think.
Yeah.
And the issue is, and then keep it objective. Don't bring in other criteria. Don't trying to seek loyalties in the course of trying to hopefully bring in allegiances. Just say it as it is, as you believe it to be, and be clear and objective about it.
Yeah, that's
a matter of fact.
Yeah, that's really sage advice. We both had the great privilege of living through South Africa during South Africa's transition. Nelson Mandela, share with us a very specific moment in time, a Mandela moment where he inspired you, lit the fire, shaped you in some way. Can you take us back to a particular moment in time? What was it, and how did you feel at the time?
I mean, there's a lot you can say about the man, and there's a lot, that you read about and what have you, and hear and you've listened to. For me, the one was was in South Africa. Rugby is like a passion. It's a bit like ice hockey and American football and baseball in America, but rugby just has a particular passion in South Africa.
Yeah,
it's also essentially a sport that was largely if I may say, closely associated with the Afrikaner population in South Africa.
Yes.
Not to say that others don't play it, but I'm just saying.
Yes.
So symbolically, in 1994, South Africa had transitioned to a democracy. And if there's one thing everyone, people were still people still had to be convinced that there weren't going to be repercussions for the apartheid era and what have you, and that Nelson Mandela was as sincere as he said he was.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the event, I think, an example was I was at the Rugby World Cup in 1995 at the final. In fact, I was actually with that chairman I spoke about earlier.
Yes.
He invited me to his presidential suite, or his suite at the rugby ground. But the fact that when South Africa won the match, I mean, you still had people, controversial at the time, waving the old South African flag as well as the new South African flag. So you had what you might call a mixed audience in that stadium.
Sure.
But it was the fact that Mandela came out wearing what was a symbol of Afrikanerdom, which was a Springbok rugby jersey.
Yeah.
With number 6, which was the number of the captain, Francois Pienaar.
Yeah.
He came out to these screaming hordes because, South Africa had just won it, to present Francois Pienaar with the Rugby World Cup. And I guess in that moment, I think what was significant, and there were a number of steps that were significant. The first step for me was he presented the cup to Francois Pienaar, the Springbok rugby captain, and then stepped away. He didn't want to take the limelight. I mean, he could easily have just taken the limelight and just absorbed it all because, he was such a world figure to everybody. But he stepped away and let everything center on the rugby captain and his team to enjoy that moment.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, the second step for me was, so to me, sorry, the point I want to close off there was the humility with which that was done.
Yes.
And the grace in which it was done.
Yes.
The second step was, at least for me, was he was in a stadium where I wouldn't say that everybody in that stadium necessarily was convinced or persuaded by him or about him.
Yeah.
But he was there and he was willing to confront them, to cheer with them, and to enjoy their moment.
Yes.
And I think, again, to me, it was a major harmonizing feature. I think it was very transformational in South Africa. I mean, people actually came away convinced of that, of his sincerity, of his humility, and I think the honesty with which it was done. There was no political motive behind that or anything. It was just something that was a threshold moment in South Africa at that point, being essentially transformed into what became loosely referred to as the Rainbow Nation. And I thought it was courageous of him, because he didn't know what sort of reaction he might get. But I think it was honorable of him to show leadership. He was showing real leadership there.
Absolutely.
That, this wasn't, the masses of people in one of the African townships, which obviously were all, happy with his release, his elevation to president, what have you. This was a population which was still being convinced in many ways. He stood there on his own in front of, I don't know how many, 60, 70,000 people.
Yeah.
And he had that stadium roaring. I mean, everybody was cheering and roaring. Yes. It was a very emotional moment, but a very significant moment. And that to me that always stood out, is that, that here was someone who is leading without necessarily having to, to almost demand that they be shown as a leader. It was just a natural assimilation of events, circumstances, and demonstration of leadership without sort of sitting there thumping his own chest.
Absolutely. And you take me back to a very emotional day in the life of South Africa and the world, actually. So to what extent do you think Mandela's leadership and that his quality of leadership and the quality of his life is relevant today, Phil? And specifically, what do you think are the big challenges we are facing today that Mandela could help lead and navigate and show us the way?
Wow, when I think of all the challenges we face now, I could probably go
but
on
maybe
forever.
No. Let's just,
I know.
I'm mindful of your time too. We just pick like the top sort of 3 challenges that.
Well, I think the issue, for example, is climate. The problem we've got in the world now is so divided and disjointed.
Yeah.
We've got this huge rise of nationalism, and I've seen it, given my own background, having worked for the Gavi Alliance and vaccines, and obviously I've been following that closely, given my association with that. But and then you've seen, various political leaders who are obviously putting national interests before global interests, and those I'm talking about leaders who come from countries which have traditionally and hitherto, such as in your country, in the United States, who have, where the US, whether they like it or not, have been seen as a benchmark around civil liberties, a democracy, the rule of law and accountability and so forth. But and it's not just there. It seems to be we seem to be surrounded by it now, by strong autocratic leaders. Crucial decisions have to be taken for mankind. And it's going to require a very special type of leader to persuade people that they're going to have to, in some way, forego certain closely held, mostly national interests to look at what the greater good is.
Yes.
Mandela could do that. He did that with, he even did that. I mean, even among and within his ANC, the African National Congress, there were people who wanted vengeance, they wanted revenge, they wanted retribution. And he was able to, push that back and say, let's look at the bigger, greater good of things. What do we want for our future? What do we want for ourselves? What do we want for our children? What do we want for their children? And so on. Mm-hmm. He had that sort of harmonizing ability to be able to synthesize that message in a way which people would respect. I could see him being a very harmonizing force in an environment that says to people, let's take a step back and think about the bigger picture, not about what matters to us now, but what is the future we want for our children and their children. Mm-hmm. He would be somebody, that's a scenario which I could see him fit and healthy, playing a very commanding role. I think there'd be 2 angles that he would take at it. One was that, pointing out the peril that mankind faces, and that this is an interest that should be common to all of us. It's not like someone's more threatened than somebody else. We're all threatened by it. Mm-hmm. I think what he might then do is probably, because that's really where his interest lies, is then make a plea for the implications of the decisions on the essentially the poor countries, mm-hmm. the lower income countries, mm-hmm. and the challenges they will have to conform to this. Mm-hmm. And then ask for some level of realism and how this can be accomplished. Mm-hmm. I think at the end of the day, you always try to come back to, at least my observation, to it's one thing to have an ideology, it's another thing to how it's practically executed. Yeah. And so I think he would play a lot with that. He'd play a lot with everybody. This is all of us. This is something that affects all of us, and we all need to be concerned about it. You can't sit in isolation. The climate doesn't sort of sit uniquely in China or sit uniquely in Germany or sit uniquely in Ecuador and South America. Climate is climate. What happens in the Amazon jungles affects all sorts of climatic patterns. What happens in the Congo is the same thing. It's what happens in huge industrial manufacturing places, whether in America or China or Europe. All of this affects all of us. And I think that would be his first play. His second play, to my mind, would then be, how are we going to do this practically so there's a degree of equity in it? Because this is going to be the biggest challenge. The biggest challenge of all of this is that the poorest nations don't have the wherewithal, politically, resource-wise, finances, whatever it might be. Mm-hmm. And so what might happen is, if you get a bunch of rich nations deciding something which they can afford and they can address, the question is, it's going to be applied universally. There's going to be hardly any exceptions. And the question is, how do you make that work universally? And I think that's what he would grapple with. And he would probably spend, I think his strength would probably be more in the background, that he would be working in the background in trying to get some form of, consensus and what have you among key people, with key decision makers in that process.
That's an interesting perspective. And in fact, if we think about what he did, he started negotiating with the apartheid government 5 years before he was released. Going back to your point about, how Mandela really inspired the nation and, and inspired the world. I mean, it's just an interesting, but, as you talk, Phil, I know we've touched on this previously and, probably a different conversation for a different day, but it sounds like the world is really being called out to rethink our governance structures in the world. You make the point, these climate agreements, there is no central body that can really hold people to account. And so, it kind of conjures up an imagination that says perhaps we need global governance structures that can hold countries accountable. Perhaps we need, a new way of governing the world. And, like I say, perhaps that's a conversation for a different day.
Yeah.
But it seems like the current structures in the world and just working through these current models are not really serving the world, with these competing interests.
I don't believe so.
Yeah, you don't believe so. I mean, maybe just briefly your thoughts around a new governance structure for the world, Phil.
Oh, I think the difficulty I have is that when these governance structures were established shortly after the World War II, where there was a very different world that we lived in.
Yeah.
There was, it was very much, almost there was a very small group of nations that had a big impact on everybody else. And they could and were able to negotiate and set up these institutions as they indeed did. I also felt there was a different level of leadership at the time that had come out of the horrors of the Second World War and actually we're really genuinely concerned not to see that happen again. We now live in a world that is, where that small group is no longer. I mean, all the many countries that were, sort of subjected to the establishment of the international organizations at the time are now themselves independent, self-governing, and what have you. So it'll be a massive political effort to actually bring that together. And what worries me always with humanity is that somehow we have to have an absolute calamity. And when I say calamity, I don't mean, a catastrophe of the nature of the pandemic or a catastrophe of, some, major climate events. I'm talking a real catastrophe which affects all of us and it horrifies all of us. And it seems that only when humanity gets to that level are they able to then harness that sort of common purpose. So to find a governing body at the moment that could, because the issue of you can establish as many international governing bodies you want. You already have the United Nations,
Sure.
But you have a Security Council where certain members have a right to veto matters. So already you have deadlocks there. The key to any international organization is how you deal with deadlocks and how you enforce accountability. How do you enforce? And that's the biggest problem because that's a basic fundamental governance issue. As I always advise people, policymakers around the world, you can create as many rules as you like. But if you can't enforce it, then everyone's going to assume that operating in breach of the rules is the norm. And then you basically defy all the efforts you've put into creating the laws themselves. You have to have an enforceability mechanism.
Of course.
And I struggle in this world, particularly now with the geopolitical sort of sensitivities that we see in various parts of the world, how you could easily bring that together in a way where everybody's interests are felt to be represented. I think that would be very difficult. I think what's going to happen is the world's going to devolve into sort of almost regional blocks, which is probably what it was before events like World War II.
Well, I mean, I hear you, and in many ways, I think COVID is almost a dress rehearsal for climate change. And I mean, I'm not sure that regional blocks are going to pull us together to do what we need to do as a human race to navigate climate. And climate change and the wrath of nature is non-negotiable. I mean, it's
the one big issue is civil society has, I think civil society has played a big role around, the way it lobbies, the way it sort of harnesses coalitions. And I think in some ways, obviously government wants to take the credit for anything around climate, but I still think that at its heart, you'll find civil society itself has played a big and important role in creating the awareness, in creating movement around that.
yeah.
And you see that, you see that even, when I look at governance and how that informs environmental, social, and governance standards, how that informs, the emphasis for investors to pay attention to it, and how investors themselves are being held to account, through the notion of stewardship, that it's one thing for investors to hold a company to account or a board of directors to account, but what are they themselves doing to ensure that they are walking the talk that they're expecting everyone else to? And I think civil society has played a big role in that. And I think I see that be continuing. It's just that in some parts of the world, civil society are obviously, quite severely suppressed. But they certainly, and environmental activists, and certainly in a lot of the developing and poorer countries, are, the number of them that are, assassinated and what have you is horrific. But civil society has played a big role in that awareness, and I think it's going to do the same around many of these other issues.
Absolutely. Phil, in our last kind of minute together, any final takeaways, any closing thoughts for the bold leaders of the future?
Holman, as you know, is a very significant business figure, and a figure who's obviously very engaged in public policy, public interest issues, and certainly someone I've always followed with great interest, because he's always stepped out and stood out in front when many other business leaders were not happy to venture into areas they thought were prejudicial to their more traditional way of working. But I always think he made a quote in his recent book, which goes along the lines of, if you break it, you own it. And that's my message to all political leaders.
Mm-hmm.
All
leaders, right?
The question is how society holds them to account.
Yeah. And is it only political, or is it to all leaders?
I think it's to all leaders.
To all leaders.
But I especially reserve it for political leaders.
Phil, thank you so much, to a wonderful human being who certainly walks the talk. And thank you for sharing your insights and perspectives. And I love the quote from Paul Pullman, if you break it, you own it. And the role of accountability. But thank you so much, Phil, for being with us. Have a blessed and wonderful weekend, and come back again.
Okay, thanks, Anne. Thank you very much for your time. Nice talking to you.
Take care. Today, our conversation is about good governance systems, social contracts, and naked accountability. Talking to my highly principled and globally respected friend, Phil Armstrong, highlights the need more than ever for good governance systems worldwide. Why it's important that we renew, review, or recommit to our social contracts, and the need for naked accountability. What is good governance? Our founding father of corporate governance, Sir Adrian Cadbury, defined governance as a system by which a company is directed and controlled. The Cadbury Committee, set up by the London Stock Exchange, produced a 1992 report, a code of best practice that reformed corporate governance worldwide. There are 12 critical characteristics. Firstly, accountability. Secondly, transparency. Thirdly, participation. And fourth, responsiveness, to ensure that multiple stakeholders are included in establishing and enforcing the system. Additional critical characteristics include efficiency, effectiveness, ethical conduct, equity, inclusion, and a system that operates within a rule of law. The Cadbury Code was built on three major foundational pillars. Firstly, that companies and boards operate within boundaries, internal boundaries. The report's recommendations, initial recommendations, were focused on board control, board reporting, and the role of the auditor. The second foundation was that the committee aimed to find a harmony and balance between financial and social goals, between individual and communal objectives to create sustainable success. And the third foundation was the fact that there is a widely respected and accepted set of rules, a social contract. Early philosophers like Socrates in ancient Greece established the notion of a social contract. It is formally defined as an implicit or explicit agreement between members of a society to collaborate for social benefits. For example, the giving up of individual benefits to get protection by the state, like road signs, road rules, which have a collective benefit. Social contract theories became popular in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. Philosophers like French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau used the social contract theory to explain the origin of governments and the duties and obligations of its citizens. The US Constitution is often cited as an explicit example and as part of the American social contract. Friends, our governance systems and social contracts are only as strong as our will and willingness to hold people accountable, all people, including those in power. Broken promises, missed deadlines, and willful bad behavior don't just make other people's lives miserable. They undermine the performance of organizations and institutions by up to 50%. They tarnish personal and corporate reputations and account for most divorces. Holding people accountable, self and others, learning to speak up and speak out, often requires that we make tough decisions. Why are these decisions tough? Well, firstly, there is often a close call between right or wrong. There's no clear black or white. Secondly, we are often forced to choose between what is familiar and known and what is unfamiliar and unknown. And as humans, we gravitate towards familiarity. Thirdly, there is often a high cost of doing the right thing. Doing the right thing comes with significant losses. And finally, there is often a value conflict. You may be a great supporter of democracy, but dislike intensely the immigration policy of the current Democratic Party. But you can learn to toughen up and fall in love with tough decisions by knowing that life calls us out frequently to make these tough decisions. They're not going to go away. Secondly, nothing lasts forever. And thirdly, making the tough decision is not always the most important. New York Times best-selling author of Crucial Accountability, Joseph Grenny, provides research, insights, and tools. His work reveals that, firstly, there is a silent majority. Most people will not speak up and speak out. Secondly, it's a mass thing. It is not worth their risk. However, he also discovered that when you give people a civic response, an alternative that will help reduce the risk of retribution and retaliation. For example, when people cut into a line and you can give people a response that says, "Please, sir, you may not have noticed, but we've been waiting in this line for more than 30 minutes. It changes the calculation and more people will speak up and speak out. Despite the fact that many bold institutions uphold the principles of good governance and social contracts, when people fail to hold people to account and wrongdoing is sealed in the walls and halls of secrecy, our governance systems, our governments, and our social contracts implode. But you too can learn to toughen up, to fall in love with tough decisions, and to strengthen our governance systems and social contracts. You too can learn to speak up and speak out. So until next time, remember that leading boldly is about making thoughtful, clear choices. And bold leadership is about taking bold action, just one small step at a time, one step for you. But together, in a world of accountability, naked accountability, and harmony, a giant step for humanity. Take care and take thoughtful, bold action.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Leading Boldly into the Future. Please find links and connections mentioned in this show in our blog and never miss an episode by subscribing at anne-pratt.com. That's ANNE-PRATT.com. May these insights from inspiring industry leaders, remarkable disruptors, and courageous champions of change bring forth a brand new you, emboldened, empowered, and ready to inspire hope. Come back soon, share with your friends, sign up on anne-pratt.com and join our movement for change. Why? Because the world needs you to lead boldly too.